Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second in our series of 5 webinars on sustainability, sponsored by the Lifelong Learning Office. It's wonderful that we've had so many people sign up for the first and then now the second, and it's nice to be here. Sorry you all couldn't be in Lexington with us, where you could have experienced some snow flurries this afternoon. And if I rub my hands together, it's because it's 62 degrees in my office for some reason. But anyway, my name is Jim Casey. I'm a professor of economics, and I'm serving as tonight's moderator, and I'm also the faculty advisor for the webinar series on sustainability. I'm also a member of the class of 1991. So if there are any of my classmates out there, hello to the class of 1991. Maybe I'll see you this spring for our delayed 30th reunion. We have a great lineup for you all tonight that I'm really excited about. And before I introduce them, just a brief reminder of what we covered last week in just defining sustainability. So very quickly, sustainability or sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. Oftentimes we think about it in the context of the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profits, and the intersection of those 3. And in tonight's session, we'll be focusing on an incredibly important topic, which is sustainable food production. Australian economist John Quiggin, in an essay he wrote several years ago, asked the big question, which is, can we produce enough food without destroying the planet? That's kind of the big, broad question of sustainability. And the 3 speakers that we have lined up tonight are going to give us some great insights into that large question and some smaller, more specific questions as well. Each of the speakers will speak for 15 minutes, leaving us with about 30 minutes to address your questions. And we ask that you please, as your questions come up, put them into the Q&A on Zoom. Don't wait until the end. It just makes for a more efficient process when we finally do get to the Q&A. And hopefully we can answer as many questions as possible, or the speakers can do that. So a brief introduction for each of our speakers. First, Dr. Chelsea Fisher, who is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies. And tonight we'll be exploring the relationship between farming and the environment. Dr. Fisher earned her PhD in anthropological archaeology from the University of Michigan in 2019 and joined our environmental studies program in that same year. In the 3 short years that she has been here, Professor Fisher has developed a reputation on campus as an outstanding educator, and I believe you will see that tonight. Her classes are in incredibly high demand, and so it's wonderful for me to be able to introduce her tonight. Our second speaker, Niquole Esters, is Senior Director of Development for Conservation International, and will be focusing her comments on global oceans and conservation measures to sustain the world's fisheries. Niquole graduated from W&L in 2004 with degrees in environmental studies and politics, and received her MA in 2008 from King's College London in geopolitics, territory, and security. Niquole works in the space between sustainable natural resource management, conservation, and economic development, with an eye toward protecting important ecosystems and the services that they provide. Lastly, tonight we will hear from Dr. Kim Hodge, W&L's Director of Sustainability Initiatives and Education, and recently has become a member of the Virginia Department of Education's Environmental Education Advisory Committee. Dr. Hodge will be discussing how W&L has adopted sustainable practices and how our students on campus are integrated into those practices through the experiential learning component of our environmental studies program. And since I know she won't do it, I'm going to go ahead and do it and say that without Dr. Hodge, none of these programs would exist. If they did exist, they wouldn't run the way they do. Dr. Hodge is an outstanding colleague for all of us in the environmental studies program. I'd also be remiss not to mention that she received her PhD in forest resources and environmental conservation down in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech, which doesn't bother me, even though I'm an NC State PhD in forest resources and conservation, but that's okay, Kim. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chelsea Fisher for tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight for this webinar, and for the folks that put it together behind the scenes. Thank you. So I will get my slides up and running and start to talk to you tonight about the long view of agricultural sustainability that we can get through archaeology, which is the field that I specialize in. Sustainability asks us to think in the long term. And I think for a lot of us, we look forward with our sustainability thinking, but it also, I think, requires us to look to the past and to understand how we're entering a story that's already in progress. And we inherit and have to learn to live with, right? A series of ongoing historical legacies. Archaeology, as the study of the human past, allows us to get at times in our collective past when human societies have had to navigate periods of great environmental stress before. Not quite like the things that we're dealing with now, but perhaps similar enough that we can learn something from these past encounters with sustainability and unsustainability when it comes to our food and agriculture. So the question that I want to think about with you tonight is, what can we learn from past sustainable agriculture? And perhaps even more, what can we learn from past unsustainable agriculture? I'm going to walk us through 3 different case studies that follow out this question of what we can learn from the past, both in our successes and our failures in our collective human history. The first example I'll look at comes from the ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest. Then we're going to go up north and look at the Greenland colonies founded by the Norse. And we're going to end with a little bit of my particular research that I do in the Maya area with the Maya civilization. The things I'm going to be talking about with you tonight come from an article I published in 2020 that you can see a citation for at the bottom there. And this is also stuff that I talk about in my book project, which hopefully will be coming out soon, in the not too distant future. So let's start with the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest. These were Native American groups that were living in an extremely dry, arid environment. And in the deserts of the American Southwest, they came up with irrigation and other kinds of dryland farming techniques that allowed them to control against rainfall variability and to mitigate against some of the risk associated with droughts and also extreme raining events. This let them extend the growing season in ways that agriculture without canals, without irrigation, wouldn't have allowed them to do. And because of irrigation, communities in this ancestral Puebloan tradition were able to aggregate. They were able to come together and live in these large desert communities, famous example being Chaco Canyon, which you see here. But even as irrigation brought all these benefits up front and really incentivized people to cluster together and to live in this desert environment, there were risks involved. So irrigation infrastructure could be really easily damaged during, say, severe flood events. And what we see through the archaeological record, through looking at what each of these different societies within this larger culture left behind, we see that communities responded very differently to those risks. And I think we can learn a lot from the way that they navigated these times of climate stress. So when climate would get stressful and irrigation infrastructure would be threatened, some societies in this culture region really doubled down. They dug their heels in and they committed to irrigation agriculture more than ever. Those communities that really dug their heels in and doubled down experienced heightened social inequality. They experienced violence and warfare, and they tended to have more health crises. So as a couple examples of this, with Mesa Verde, which you're seeing here, their irrigation system was super centralized and very hierarchical. And it seems like a lot of folks were kind of dragged along for the ride of the irrigation agriculture. There was a lot of social inequality, to the point where when things started to break down during a period of extreme climate stress, people seem to have no problem just abandoning the entire thing altogether and just leaving, and the entire system broke down. With the Hohokam, we see another example of groups that dug their heels in. In this case, there was a very complex irrigation network that was very centralized, and it had developed over 1,000 years. When there was climate stress affecting the Hohokam, what people did was they doubled down and they stayed committed to the irrigation systems. And there's signs from bioarchaeology, the study of human remains, that they suffered extreme public health crises as a result of refusing to walk away even as their system was falling apart around them. At the same time, there's examples of communities that navigated these periods of climate stress in ways that were sustainable and allowed them to be resilient and to bounce back from these periods of extreme floods and droughts. So one example of this kind of more nimble approach is the Zuni. They also were practicing irrigation agriculture, but theirs was decentralized and it was always small scale. And as a result, it could be easily adapted when some of these extreme weather events would happen. And the Zuni were able to navigate through these periods of climate stress that brought other societies down. Likewise, the Mimbres, also practicing irrigation agriculture, also having to deal with these same climate stressors. But we see that they had a more diversified food system. They were willing to walk away from their irrigation infrastructure temporarily, to go into other types of subsistence strategies, and then to return to irrigation when conditions had improved. We see then that these groups were able to use the same technology, but in sustainable ways, whereas other groups were not. Let's go to our second case study up in the North Atlantic, the Norse colonies of Greenland. So you know the Norse, maybe you know them as the Vikings, but so these were Scandinavian people that began to leave Europe and set up colonies in the North Atlantic starting around 1000 AD. They set up colonies in Greenland as well as in Iceland and the Faroe Islands. And the Greenland colonies collapsed, whereas the others on Iceland and the Faroe Islands continued on for some time. And for a long time, this was a mystery. What went so wrong in Greenland? But recently, through archaeology and studies of these Greenland colonies and what they left behind when they were abandoned, we now have a sense of what did go wrong that caused these colonies to be abandoned while others around them continued on. When the Norse Greenlanders first arrived in Greenland, they tried basically to immigrate their subsistence strategies right with them. They tried to replicate what had worked and what had been important to them in Scandinavia in this new environment of the North Atlantic. And that was agropastoralism. So for these Greenland colony farmers, what they would do is they relied on a mix of livestock and then growing grain that they used to feed the livestock. So livestock could eat grass in summer, and then over winter, they would have to eat whatever could be grown during the warmer months. But this was not Scandinavia. And there were year-to-year variations in rainfall that meant that each year, people's livestock herds wouldn't all survive, and those herds began to shrink. So in order to cope with this, the Norse Greenlanders looked to other strategies that they could use as kind of fallbacks. And so one of the fallbacks that they came up with was hunting wild marine resources, and especially seals. This worked pretty well for a time. They were able to buffer against the risk that their cattle and other animals were undergoing, that their fields were undergoing, by supplementing their diet with wild foods from the sea. However, even though it worked for a time in the short term, what they could not have known was that they were coming up against a much larger climatic change. And that is this period known as the Little Ice Age. So the Greenlander colonists, they couldn't have known it, but the time when they settled Greenland happened to be an abnormally warm time in the tail end of the medieval warm period. And so when they began adapting with these short-term strategies of seal hunting, what they couldn't have known is that they were about to plunge into this much colder period. And hunting had become, at this time, no longer just like a fallback kind of famine strategy. It had become a primary way of living, hunting these beautiful creatures that you see here, these seals. And like I said, it worked for a while, but as temperatures cooled, sea ice grew, the seas became rougher and stormier, and what had been a reliable subsistence strategy, seal hunting, became extremely dangerous. And it became a rigidity trap, meaning that once they had become so invested in this one particular strategy, they couldn't adapt. They were so committed to it that it made them extremely vulnerable when these cold periods of the Little Ice Age really began. So the Norse Greenland colonies were abandoned by the 15th century because they couldn't adapt after they had made this commitment to seal hunting. There were other changes that happened around the same time that exacerbated these climatic shifts. So the Black Death in Europe, the plague there, as well as a diminished market for ivory, left Greenland really vulnerable. On the other hand, Iceland and the Faroe Island colonies were able to diversify, and so they were able to make it through this really rough period of climate stress. Okay, our third example, the Maya civilization in Mexico and Central America. You might be familiar with some of these really elaborate Maya cities that developed in the jungle. And in terms of the agriculture that the Maya used to feed these cities, there was a big prevalence of state-sponsored agricultural infrastructure. So stuff like terrace systems, reservoirs, raised fields, urban agriculture. And all of these systems, for the most part, were centralized and closely linked to notions of divine kingship. Kings were responsible for bringing the rain. Kings were responsible for the success of harvests. The Maya, like the Norse Greenlanders, could not have known that they were headed for an extremely rough period of climate in which these claims of divine kingship would no longer hold up the way that they once had. What this meant is that during periods of extreme climate stress, many Maya cities couldn't adapt. They were similarly in these rigidity traps where they could not become flexible and try out different strategies. And as a result, you get the famous Maya collapse, where around AD 900 to 1100, these cities were abandoned. Now, what's really interesting in archaeology recently is that as there's been more projects that are looking at the experience of rural farmers and not just at these big cities, we're learning that the collapse was really an experience that might have been limited to the nobility living in these cities. In my own research that I do in Yucatan, Mexico, on communities of rural Maya farmers that successfully managed to make it through this collapse event, what my team of researchers have been finding is that they were able to do so because they were flexible and adaptable with their agriculture. In the case of the site where I work in Yucatan, that adaptation looked like a shift from strategies that were really based in in-field agriculture and intensification around the house, so permanent, continuous, high input agriculture, that farmers started with that, but then eventually gave it up in favor of more flexible strategies of extensive practices practiced over a wide range. And so rural Maya farmers, unlike their counterparts living in cities, were able to make it through the collapse without really any sign that their lives changed very much at all. So to zoom back out and look at these three cases, what can we learn from these cases of the ancestral Puebloans, the Norse Greenland colonies, and the Maya? I think there's many things, but two that I want to draw forward tonight are this common thread that doubling down on a limited range of practices or foods is risky and leads to this problem of rigidity traps. I think we need to take a long and hard look at our food system and our own reliance on a very limited range of plants and animals that we eat, as well as our entrenched dependence on industrial forms of agriculture. If we look at these examples from the past, we see that long-term agricultural sustainability is rooted in flexibility. It's rooted in adaptability and this kind of nimble adjustment to work with local ecology rather than to work against it, and to be ready to embrace the precarity of these situations. So I want to leave you with this question of how can we apply this long view of sustainable agriculture for the future? And I feel the most hopeful about the movement to support traditional, indigenous, and local food. So rather than thinking that there's some lost ancient technology that we need to recover from these past civilizations, what I encourage you to do is to look for ways to support those grassroots movements and organizations that are preserving indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge and foodways through groups like the Indigenous Food Systems Network, Soul Fire Farm, and the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, to find more ways to eat food that's grown or harvested in ways that work with local ecology, and to also learn about Indigenous history and foodways in whatever land you're on using websites like nativeland.ca. And so thank you so much for listening. I'm excited to hear from the other presenters and to talk with anybody who has any questions about this. So thank you.
Great. So I think I'm next, unless there's something I'm missing. I will share my screen. And there we go. All right, so hello everyone. So we're gonna go from the land to the sea, and I'll hopefully give you a little bit more insight into what's going on in the world of sustainability and fisheries. All right, so first off, a little bit about me. First and foremost, I am not a scientist. so one of the great things about Washington and Lee was that it gave me a really interdisciplinary education. As Professor Casey said, I graduated with a BA in environmental studies in geology and politics. And I think I was part of the certificate program. I think the next year it actually became a major, and I was very bitter about that. When I got my master's from King's College in London, I studied geopolitics, territorial security. And so what that meant was boundary issues between countries. And because I'm interested in the oceans, it was maritime issues, fisheries disputes, oil and gas disputes, boundary disputes, just in general. But you will see to the right, every once in a while, I do actually get to go out into the field. That's me looking very cool and away from the scientists in a hat and the khakis. That is a turtle tagging trip that we did. My main job for a majority of my career has been to negotiate policy with decision makers, whether they are of communities and community leaders or corporations, things like that. And so my job has been to take what is someone tagging a turtle, in Papua New Guinea, on a small little island in Papua New Guinea. How does that connect to someone at the UN level or in a ministry or in a department? And so I've been with Conservation International, did 2 stints. One was right out of Washington Lee University. That was a thanks to Professor Conley, who just retired and helped me out with that. And then after I got my master's, I came back and I've been back with CI ever since. So the other thing about that is that since I am not a scientist, I have a kind of high intersectional viewpoint about things. And so I'm kind of very pragmatic about how things are approached. And I always keep in mind that there might be a number of things that are happening that you may or may not know about. And my job is to find it out and to kind of try to make connections between the various audiences and at play. So switching over to fisheries, I'll give you a couple basic facts. 3 out of in the world depend on seafood as their main source of protein, and 44% of the world's population lives within 93 miles of the coast. I myself have always spent at least 150 kilometers away. I tried to do it roughly on Google Maps, and I think Lexington is even within that 93 miles. Those numbers are just increasing. And so, majority of the world or a lot of the world and rising has a very close relationship to the coast, whether they know it or not. What that means is that we need to be very kind of intentional about and organized about how we address the issues that facing our lands and facing everything else that impact our society and our world. For those of you who don't know, these are the Sustainable Development Goals. They were agreed to in 2015, 17 goals to transform our world. You can see how much they cover. They go all the way to 2030. And the reason why I include this is because this is the foundation from which a lot of decision-making institutions craft their policies, whether they are national governments, whether they are corporations, whether they are funding mechanism, financing institutions. A lot of folks, and an increasing amount of institutions, are referencing the SDGs in their decision making. And so understanding that, and even my organization ties our work to the SDGs. And so you will see 14, life underwater, is the one that is the most obvious connection. And so you will see these four reference fishing, sustainable fishing, supporting small scale fishers, increasing economic benefits, and ending subsidies. But it's very easy to see that the other targets, and I'm just kind of pulling out the other 4 other ones, are also connected, right? You're not going to have sustainable fishing unless you have, ecosystems that are healthy and you have reduced marine pollution, right? You're not going to be able to have economic benefits without having an enforcement system or regime and have, international law, right? You're not going to be able to really create or take advantage or operate in a sustainable fishing situation if you don't have the underlying ecosystems and mechanisms and regulations to support it. All of that is to say, everything is connected, right? And that's just within target 14. That's just within the life below water target. Fishing also connects to all of these other sustainable development goals. Hunger, obviously, gender equality. People very frequently think about fishermen, but fisher ladies and children of fishing communities also play a huge role in terms of fishing activities, whether they are collecting and harvesting along the coast. They are, talking about larger, they are in warehouses, in, processing centers. You're talking about, number 8 having to do with economics. If you're looking at a Pacific Island nation, they are ocean states. And so most of their GDP, or a large portion of their GDP, comes from what is in the sea, what they can license in terms of fishing. You're talking about, human rights, peace and things like that. You're talking about, illegal activities, the same boats and the same ships and the same things and people that are operating illegal arms and drugs are also operating illegal fish, whether they are shark finning or whether they are, catching tuna, shrimp and things like that. It's not just one boat, right? It's whatever is available. I have space for guns. I have space for drugs. I have space for human trafficking. I also have some space for some illegal shrimp and sharks as well. They are not picky. When you're talking about, this is a global issue. So 17 has to deal with partnerships, right? You're going to need to include partners from all around the world, all of different sectors, at different parts of the community, at different parts of society. And of course, the connection to life on land, what happens on land ends up in the sea, right? Whether it's agricultural runoff, whether it's landslides, whether it's, pollution that's dumped in from manufacturing waste. And then, obviously climate action as well. Oceans absorb most of carbon dioxide in the world. I can't remember, this is one of my scientific colleagues that would know this, but I want to say like 1 out of every 3 breaths that people take comes from the ocean. The oxygen comes from the ocean. And so fisheries is not only connected to, the ocean, but it's connected to all parts of society. And so I wanted to talk about what Conservation International's approach to dealing with this is. And it actually, I learned from Washington Lee colleagues that you all focus on, I want to get this right. What is it? At Conservation International, we focus on production, balancing production and protection. So it aligns very closely. And I wanted to provide an example. So another fact is that up to 10% more carbon is stored in coastal habitats than tropical forests per unit area. Coastal habitats, meaning mangroves, right? So when you're thinking about carbon, you're thinking about climate. Okay, so you have one habitat that deals with carbon and climate folks. They're interested. everything having to do with that. Mangroves are also the nurseries for fisheries, right? A lot of babies are born and spend a few years in mangroves, right? And so that's important. They also filter water. They also provide coastal protection from
So it looks as if we are having some technical difficulties, folks.
Can you see me again? Sorry about that.
Oh, all right, Niquole, you're back. Excellent.
Crack. All right. So, all right, let's try this again. So I was saying, carbon, you have your carbon, you have your fisheries people who are interested in making sure that there is a nursery habitat. There are people that are interested for filtration, for sanitation, for health and vitality of water. And then you have folks that are actually interested in, once those babies grow up, they leave and they go out and they swim across the Pacific, at least in, where I am. I'm in Oakland, California. So they swim across from places like Indonesia and the Philippines. They spend a few years there in their mangroves and their nurseries, and then they turn into giant tuna that swim over towards me. And so you have people that are in corporations. And so all of that means is that there are different audiences that you have to deal with. There's also the communities that own the land and that are intersecting, are involved with the stewardship and the ownership and the maintenance of that coastal community and that coastal habitat. And so the audience that you're looking at can range from communities all the way to governments, ministries, departments, businesses at all scales, and decision-making forums. So you can talk about a local community, village elder. You can talk about local government. You can talk about state or provincial government, national government, UN forums, fisheries forums, all of these different kind of decision-making forums and platforms. And so at Conservation International, we look at how we have over the years developed programs to address and to target each of those types of groups of people, knowing, of course, that there's intersection, right? And so we have a coastal communities program, we have a sustainable tuna program, responsible aquaculture, ocean finance. How is it that we incentivize investment towards operations, towards policies and regulations, towards practices and approaches, tools that will lead towards sustainable fishing. And underlying all of this is human rights and social responsibility. I have a colleague who focuses on human rights and issues of slavery on fishing vessels. There's well documented examples of organized crime with fisheries. It's the same thing actually with farming and a lot of other, of course, manufacturing processes and procedures. But running through all of that, running through all of our programs is the recognition and the integration of human rights and social responsibility. And so I think I'm a little
So it sounded like Niquole possibly was getting close to the end of her presentation. And so I think to keep the flow going.
And I'm back.
Oh, Niquole is
and
back.
I'm back. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
But I just wanted to say one last thing. It's funny. I'm in the Bay Area, so theoretically I should have the best technology ever, but I just can't help it. But one last note, like I said before, I have a high level. I'm very pragmatic. As you think about all of these audiences, it's critically important to understand what their values and what their priorities are. I have a colleague in South Africa that put it best. He was talking to a bunch of ranchers, and an elder rancher turned around and had said to him, "I will value your elephants when you value my cattle." And so when you have these conversations, when you think about these conversations, it's important to understand where they are coming from, where their perspectives are, whether they are a business person or a community person or a government person, because otherwise you will be spinning wheels for many, many years. And so with that, I will give it to the next person and apologize for the technology issues.
Okay, I think it's me. Yes, Jim, you ready to go? Okay. Hi, everybody. Going to share my screen. Thanks to Jim for the incredibly kind introduction. You actually made me get a little teary. So the sustainability programs at WNL have been going on actually before I got here. If you're familiar with Professor Hamilton, Professor Casey, Professor Kahn, Professor Humston, Professor Greer, all of these wonderful folks came before me. And so I was hired on in 2013 and have been working on a lot of food systems and composting because I have a counterpart that works in the energy world. So we collectively do sustainability broadly through all kinds of programs, but because today's presentation was on food and farms and fisheries, I'm choosing to focus on the food systems at WNL. And the way they're kind of written into our priorities are both in the strategic plan and our climate action plan. To identify, you'll see them bold, to identify and prioritize opportunities to reduce resource consumption and waste. And then in the climate action plan, we have under the waste minimization part, to strengthen and support campus recycling and composting. So to just give you a history of our compost program in the garden, you'll see there's Professor Hamilton looking very young back in 2002 with our newly purchased earth tub that when I got here in 2013, it was broken and we had to spin it by hand. And so it was time for probably a new compost unit because we would fill this thing up a half of the way through the semester. But meanwhile, the campus garden got started on back campus. So if you are familiar with where the baseball field is, you just kind of keep walking back through the woods, and that's where the campus garden is. They hired me in 2013, and then in 2014, we started the Office of Sustainability. And these are some interns from, I think they've all graduated at least a couple of years ago, but these are some of your colleagues, some of your alumni colleagues. And then in 2015, we hired the campus garden manager. This is Niquole Pullen. She's still in the same position. In 2016, we received funding to build this large composting unit. And it is the same thing that the Virginia Department of Transportation uses to break down roadkill. So we were joking before you all signed on that yes, this is fancy enough, even though it doesn't look it, it's fancy enough to break down a whole hog or a deer or whatever we decide to get out there. So it's a static aerated pile. You can't see it, but there are PVC pipes underneath the flooring of that concrete that blow air up through it, and that air helps heat everything up and cooks it and breaks everything down really, really well. So you can see a finished pile of compost kind of behind where the two people are standing in the bay. These are all the things that we can now compost on campus. So probably when Niquole was there, you were only maybe composting vegetables and easy things that we could compost. Now we can put almost everything in that static aerated pile, and things that people don't ever think about, like meats and bones and grain or liquids and things that we don't like so much are cooking oils, and of course glass and gloves and gum is just gross. So we try to not put that in there. So in addition to the compost program growing, the campus garden program grew, and this is what the campus garden looks like today. Except that a couple of weeks ago with that big snowstorm and the ice, it collapsed. You can see that big structure in the back, and it collapsed the whole structure. So now we have to try and figure out how to get another hoop house. But that's what it looked like a month ago. Well, not a month ago, but the structure was there a month ago. And then in addition to the campus garden being there, campus kitchen is hugely involved in what we're doing out there. They, the year of COVID, had 500 individual signups on our volunteer signups thing called Give Pulse. Students and people can go in on Give Pulse and sign up to say they want to work in the campus garden, and 500 individual slots throughout the COVID year. And granted, that's a little different because, you know, people couldn't do anything inside, so they were all rushing to help us outside. But a lot of that volunteerism has actually lasted over the last year and a half or so. So we could not grow what we grow without campus kitchen students. And so then it becomes this, I'll show you a graph later on, but it's this really pretty little closed loop cycle where we grow the compost from dining services and campus kitchen, the compost feeds production, and then we put the food back into the community that we're growing into the garden. All right, so this is how we do it. That is Betsy the truck. She is very stinky, and she is now joined by Marshmallow, another white truck. And we have 30 some Compost Crew students that are paid to pick up food waste and compostables every day of the week. And sometimes there's 2 or 3 shifts a day. We also have a part-time Compost Operations assistant. We collect from every dining facility on campus, the campus kitchen, sororities, some fraternities, science center, library, and major events. And that was kind of before COVID. We haven't done a lot of events since then. We also have a post-consumer food pulper in the marketplace. So we're getting food prep from dining services, but we're also getting like food scrapings, plate scrapings from when students are finished with their food in the marketplace. And it's just so gross. It like falls into these green bins and then spins all the water out, and it looks sort of like meatloaf grossness, but it's beautifully perfect for the compost bin. It breaks down gorgeously. And we would set up these trash tents at major events on Cannon Green. So in 2019, we collected 1,200 pounds of food waste, but only had 6.5 bags of trash over the course of 5 events, which is just insane to me. Like that's averaging 1 bag of trash per event. And so, or 1.25, whatever it is. So, you know, before we would do this stuff, we would just get bags and bags and bags and bags to go to the landfill. But instead, all of this beautiful food waste was going over to right on back campus to break down to grow more food. All right, I'm going to try this video. Oh, yay, I hope it works. Okay, this is our crew in action. I'm so proud of them.
Is a group of students once or twice a week for our sustainability.
All that pile up in landfills is just mental impact. We can
because
Sorry, Jim, you can't hear me. Okay. Oh no, it started over. Here, let me try and. Is that better?
and we can take some generations about addressing all the issues that they will face.
So the 2 students in that video that were speaking was Joseph and Leah, and they're both seniors. They both were with me on the sustainability pre-orientation trip from like their first year and then have stayed with the office as an intern, or Joseph is now the Compost Crew leader. He sets the schedule for all of the 30 Compost Crew kids, and I'm just immensely proud of the work that they do, because yes, like it does take a lot of time for me. I mean, I get texts from them at like 10 o'clock at night, but I don't care. I love them so much that this just makes it all worthwhile, like what the work that they're doing and how they care. And I think, you know, when we were talking, let me see if I can get out of this. When we were talking before this, we talked about how you can get sort of down in the dumps from all of the things that are happening with climate change and you know, a pandemic and all of the things kind of hitting everybody right now. And when students come to me, I get to say to them like, hey, why don't you get your hands dirty? Let's proactively engage in environmental issues and try and do something so you can physically feel better about, you know, making a change on the planet, even if it's this tiny little thing. And I think that goes a long way. Jim, how am I on time? Okay, so after all the Compost Crew collects everything, we transport the waste from the truck to the compost unit. These are gross pictures, but this is how the stuff happens. This is the left side. Everything gets piled into the left side, and it's sort of lasagnaed in. And then as it breaks down, you know, the air goes through it and heats it up. As it breaks down, you can see how hot it gets. And we maintain the temperature so that it can kill all of the like weed seeds and any sort of bacterial grossness. And then it cooks and cures. And then the things that help it break down, or if we can shred things up, or these high temperatures that we need to get things rolling, and then aeration also. And then we were also talking about this before too, is that you don't want it to be too wet. Sometimes it gets too wet and it gets really smelly. So you want it to be the right kind of moisture content. So it's almost like a recipe. You can think about it as like literally cooking with old food. So then we transport the compost into the garden or into windrows to finish cooking. And then produce is grown in the finished compost, and it's gorgeous. Look how beautiful that is. Yeah, I'm astonished at how gorgeous the food is that comes out of our garden. And then the food is harvested either by our campus garden manager or by interns or campus kitchen students. And then it's sent out to the community. So it either goes into dining services, or it goes to the campus kitchen, or it goes to Rah, which is our local food bank. So here students are prepping food for campus kitchen. And here's that beautiful little closed loop cycle. So the compost goes into the campus garden, which creates produce for dining and campus kitchen. Dining gets food from elsewhere because we can't grow nearly enough for them. And then campus kitchen sends out hot meals to community organizations. And then that food waste goes right all back to the compost. And that's the sweet spot, right? Like that closed loop cycle that we're looking for is us taking responsibility for our waste and for what we're creating on campus. And here you can see just how much that we have collected through the years. This is only through the compost unit. So this is not food waste that's gone to campus kitchen. I don't have those numbers because someone else manages that program, but you can see there's just been a couple of jumps across the years and just the amount that we are collecting. If you want to translate that to pounds, it's 118,000 pounds last year. It's insane, right? Like no one has a program like this on our campus. So you'll see a jump in 2018 from 17 tons to 56 tons. That is because we hired this amazing woman who's no longer at WNL, but she came to campus as the director of dining and decided to switch all of the to-go-ware to all compostable. So it made it super easy for all of everybody on campus to just like throw all the stuff into the compost bins, and then we could just take it back there, shred it up, make compost. So the other couple of things that are food related is that students just love to talk about food, love to be engaged in food. And so we have, even with just like student engagement stuff, we have cooking classes. This was the trip we took students to Seattle that they're playing around on Mount Rainier, but then we did a bunch of like local food, and local coffee type discussions to just teach them about food and how they can have a relationship with food. There are student organizations that are focused on food. And then our pre-orientation sustainability trips always have a food spin on it. We always eat as much local food as we can. We go to Polyface Farm to look at a kind of unique agricultural practice. They work in the campus garden. They do cooking classes there too. So we try as best as we can to incorporate food into all of our student programs. So I'm going to, I think, if you want to follow us on any of the Facebook, Instagram, all that jazz, that's all right here. So please add us to your follows. And these are the contacts if you want to know more about anything. So Jim, I'm done if you want to take over. Oh, I guess I should stop screen sharing. Yes. There we go.
So thank you, Kim. That was wonderful. And thank you, Niquole, and thank you, Chelsea. And I believe Rob and Ruth have been monitoring the Q&A. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rob and Ruth at this point to organize those questions and present them as they have come in. I think there are a few, and obviously if there are more questions, please feel free to drop things into the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Jim. There are a lot of questions, I'm sure, out there in the audience, and I hope we can get it going now and take a few minutes to write a question if you have something in mind. Chelsea, let's go all the way back to the beginning of this hour and begin with you on a question. It has to do with sustainability today in our foods, our food production. It's very interesting what you put together on a historical perspective, from a historical perspective, but here's the question: what within today's dietary preferences, as we've observed in our national diet, do not seem to you to be sustainable? Are we becoming aware of food preferences in America that really don't seem to be very sustainable as time goes by?
I love that question. Thank you for voicing that. I think that, this is an area where I'll be speculating a little bit, but I think that people are becoming increasingly aware of sustainability and what constitutes more sustainable ways of eating. I see a problem in that a lot of corporations that produce food have also learned how to use sustainability as a powerful marketing tool. And I think that has really muddied the waters in most folks' ability to go into a supermarket and choose a way of eating that is sustainable. So if you look at greenwashing trends on things ranging from Impossible burgers to quinoa, my old favorite, to ancient grains, and is it more sustainable to eat the organic lettuce from California if you're living in Virginia, or to eat the non-organic lettuce from down the road? So I think that people are becoming much more aware that this is something that we need to be thinking about. But I think what we need is more clarity and more educational resources so that we can each navigate those decisions better.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea.
Thanks.
Ruth, what do you have?
Well, this I think is a question that maybe each of you can give a couple of ideas. But what can we do as consumers to help cure some of the wrongs, or better yet, just point us back in the right direction of sustainability? Chelsea, do you want to start, and then we can go to Kim and then Niquole?
What can each of us do as consumers to be more sustainable? I think about that a lot, and I take it back to, for myself, what that looks like is
having a lot of skepticism with the claims that are made on the food that I buy. And I think that doing more research into, say, what different certification seals on the foods that we see, what those mean, I think that that's a really good place to start. What does it mean when a food says that it's Rainforest Alliance certified? What does it mean to be certified organic? And I think learning about the local food system that you're a part of and looking for ways to support that local food movement.
Thank you.
My big sticking point is not necessarily food related. I think we cycle through technology way too quickly, and it's like a peer pressure thing, right? Like you have to have the next new iPhone, or you have to have, you know, the next, like our TV, our refrigerators have TVs on them so we can see what's inside. I mean, this is like kind of ridiculous. Like, so that's like my big kind of clash with some of my friends and family members is like, no, I can, like, you can keep things for a little bit. You don't have to have the next brand new thing. But food, I agree. I think there's so much value in learning your local farmers and buying food from people who are growing it. And then, like, one of my very favorite things is so nerdy, but I love to can, and it's become something that is like connected to my heritage too. So it's like I can get cucumbers, buckets of cucumbers from my local farmer, and then turn them into these amazing pickles that are my grandmother's recipe. And that is meaningful to me on so many levels, right? Like that's sustainability, but that's also like heritage and family and home. And it just is like, Niquole used the word, what is intersectional love? I don't know, like that's where it's the sweet spot for me.
Well, I will steal a little bit from both Chelsea and Kim. You know, when I think about sustainability, I've really been focusing on just the whole aspect of my life, from what I buy for clothing to how I package things. Related to food, you know, I moved here to Oakland from Hawaii, and I am still amazed at how easy it is to access local farms and local produce. And so I have really focused, and to be honest, Google is my best friend when it comes to, you know, researching and looking up and really thinking through what sustainability means to me and what it can mean to me, right? And so, you know, mentioning or totally agreeing with Chelsea, you know, the idea and opportunities for researching is a great starting point. And take your time, pick through it. You know, Kim was talking about technology, pick through it, start with food, but you can also start expanding out to the other parts of your life and to your family's life and to your community's life about, you know, and how you can address sustainability in the best way for you.
Thank you, Niquole. Here is another question for you, Niquole. And it may draw upon what you've learned through Conservation International. Here's the question. One large difficulty we see with commercial fishing has been our historical tendency to fish down the food chain, often decimating populations and requiring intense management for stock recovery. Given the effects of climate change that we are seeing on the oceans, coupled with our ever-present need for sustaining seafood demands, how might regulatory policy measures help to remedy this issue?
That's a great question. It's pretty complicated, so I'll try to give you a little bit of my own opinion. So you would be surprised at how much regulation and policy is actually out there and existing. You know, there are binders and folders and books on numerous bookshelves around the world that have pretty good policies and regulations in them. The issue is not the policy and regulation. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely some gaps. There are definitely some needed additions in policy and regulations that need to be crafted, especially as challenges continue to emerge and things like climate change come into account and fish move and things like that. But there are some solid laws, policies, and regulations. What there aren't is the requisite enforcement. And so you can have all of the laws and all of the policies and all the regulations and all of the binders and paperwork and electronic things on websites. If you have no power or authority or infrastructure or systems in place to enforce it, then it doesn't really matter. And so you need to be able, what our work is focusing on, not even depending all on for an enforcement, because reality is a lot of places don't have the money to pay for enforcement. So you need to be creative in how you address enforcement issues. How do you go straight to someone on a boat, on a patrol boat? But how do you incentivize a community? How do you incentivize a corporation, a company, or whatever other group of people that you want, that you hope to create a change in habit? And that is kind of, for me, in my opinion, the more important thing. There's always going to be someone who creates a policy and a regulation, but the carry through, the enforcement of it is key. And that is what's been lacking around the country. And it's just, it's for a variety of reasons.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Niquole. Ruth?
There are a lot of great questions in here. I know we're not going to be able to get to them all. So I'm gonna combine a couple of them, and they have to do with campus sustainability, Kim. So these are coming to you. Impressive sustainability on campus. Love the details creating a closed loop system and the student engagement. Do you have other plans on your wish list to add to the program? And in addition to that, are there efforts to reduce the food waste in serving facilities?
Okay, so yes and yes, kind of. I can do the easy question first, is reducing food waste in the facilities. It's very interesting that you asked that, because I just sent these numbers to our director of dining, and he wrote me back and was like, "Is this normal?" Like, I don't know. As far as I know, we are one of the only institutions that has as extensive a compost program as we do. And I want to say that that's just because it just seemed ripe for it. Like, everybody's really rallied around this, from dining to facilities to the students. So I have to, we're getting ready to maybe sit down together after March and look at these numbers and figure out a way to say, like, well, what does this mean for how we're purchasing food on campus, and what kinds of food, and how are we cooking for our students? And I mean, they think about that a lot already, but is there a way that we can reduce the food waste coming in as well? So that's the easy question. The wish list question, there's a couple of things that my colleagues and I talk about a lot, and that actually President Dudley talks about too, is we've tried a couple of times recently to look at offsite solar projects that are large scale, that would essentially take our purchased electricity off of fossil fuels. And just the way that the financing worked with the first time, it didn't work out very well. And then the second time, it was the more recent time, we've had issues with we can't get things out of ports. What's the word, Rob? Help me out. We can't get the materials to us, and so
Okay.
we can't build these large scale offsite things until our distribution, that's the word, right? Until our distribution problems across the country become better. So I think, really just trying to figure out really creative and real ways to address carbon neutrality, because we could just buy our way out of it, right? Like, we could buy a bunch of offsets and claim carbon neutrality, but that's not the way that we want to do it. We want to enter into real projects that get us as close as possible to carbon neutrality, and then only use offsets if we have to. So that's sort of the wish list, is like doing everything in our power as best as we can on campus, and then only buying our way out of things if we have to.
Thank you, Kim. Chelsea, we're coming back to you now. Allie Case has a question for you. Has your past work given you any perspective on how current farming practices may be impacted by worsening climate conditions?
Thank you. And hi, Allie. I think of Allie when I have that slide with the seal pictures on it, because she did have capstone on seals. So it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I do see some parallels, but again, I think it's important to remember that what we're doing right now, what we're experiencing right now is unprecedented. But there are some signs of what we can expect. And what comes to mind when I hear your question is thinking about how the regions where crops can be grown are going to change so much as temperatures continue to warm. And so countries further to the north are already preparing for taking on a more significant role in our global food system than they maybe have had up to this point. And at the same time, our nations around the equator are having to adapt to increased risk that they're experiencing because of climate change and agriculture. And so we definitely will see regional shifts in where food is produced and what kinds of foods are produced where. And I'm reminded of another capstone in environmental studies, Anna Miller, who I think I saw was on earlier, who did an excellent capstone looking at how climate change is going to affect grape production and wine production and the flavors of wine. And so it's definitely something that will affect not only what types of foods are grown where and how, but also the very flavor of our foods will change as the climate continues to change.
Okay, thank you.
So here is a question from Walter Borda. Do you have any specific examples where a sustainability produced product has overtaken non-sustainable produced products, perhaps salmon farming in Scandinavia? And that could be for anybody.
I have small scale, local community examples. There's when the same community that was where that the sea turtle, the picture that I had with put in the front in the beginning with the sea turtle, they are part of a province in Papua New Guinea called Milne Bay, and Milne Bay is a matrilineal. By most of it is matrilineal, so land passes down through women. And there was a woman who had to wait until she received, her island to make the decisions that she wanted to make. And she had very much been lobbying for her family to be sustainable in its conservation and management of its clams. Each island focuses on different things. They were clams, giant clams, huge, beautiful clams. Dad said, no, when I die, you can do whatever you want, but I'm here, so deal with it. Dad passed away. Maria took over and said, we're gonna pause it. We're gonna pause cultivation. We're gonna pause harvesting, and was not real well received until a drought came through in 2009, 2010. And at the end of, long story short, because they had done some cultivation, laid down sustainable management and conservation practices, they ended up feeding the island communities all around them, and a whole extensive network of families and second generation and third generation and extended family members. And so that practice, their clams overtook in terms of popularity and overtook the surrounding competing factions because they were bigger, they were juicier, and they were more valuable. And so they became really known for their clams, and then their neighbors became known for their other fish and their other kind of seaweed and things like that. And so not only did they get more money for their clams, but they actually convinced some of their families in front of some of their neighbors to actually start doing the same types of practices.
Thank you, Niquole. And I think we're coming close to the end of our time now together, and I'd just like to bring it all back to education. You're all three of you are in the younger generation. You are fresh. You have fresh energy and recent education in your chosen fields. What are you observing among children today in school systems in teaching sustainability practices? What have you observed, and what are you encouraged by?
I can talk about that with our own students.
Yes.
They come to campus expecting certain things. And a lot of that is just them coming from all over the country or all over the world and seeing different sustainable practices, and then getting here and being like, wait a second, why doesn't it happen like perfectly, you know? And I think that it's a challenge for me to meet that, because the system is built the way it's built, and I wish I could, you know, wave my magic wand and make everything happen perfectly. But there's a lot less, it feels to me, there's a lot less like selling the idea and more the expectation that we should just be doing this. And I love that. It pushes me and it makes me learn from them, which is like the best thing ever. They teach me.
That's great. Well, Jim, I think that's a great place to end, that we are now dealing with new expectations among the students who arrive at WNL today. And I'm sure they're learning it from their school systems, their teachers too. So Jim, would you like to make a concluding remark?
Sure, Rob, thanks. Yeah, I want to thank Niquole and Chelsea and Kim again. That was absolutely fantastic. The presentations were wonderful. Your responses to the questions, thoughtful and insightful. And I want to thank everyone who participated. And I hope, remember that each of the webinars each week is an individual sign up. And so I hope that you will tune in again next week. I believe next week we're turning our attention to planet water, thinking about oceans and freshwater systems and the sustainable management of them over time. So thanks again, Rob and Ruth. Thank you so much. And everybody have a wonderful evening.